So welcome, Rachel.
Thanks, Emily. I'm just going to share my screen. Thank you. Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction. And also thank you for inviting me to this forum and also to this panel, which has been really, really interesting and inspiring. I'll just start first by saying that I'm giving this presentation today from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. The Algonquin peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial and are the customary keepers and defenders of the Ottawa River watershed and its tributaries. So for today, for the presentation, so a bit of an overview of what we're going to look at. So sort of the commitments and responsibilities in terms of invasive alien species for Canada, the roles and collaboration needed to address invasive alien species, and also the current priority work for the Invasive Alien Species National Committee, for which I'm a secretariat, and also sort of looking forward, what are international developments on INS that we should be on the lookout for. So this slide is a bit of a timeline, so it provides a bit of an overview of what will be presented today. So I'll go sort of through chronological order of things to do, so some international, some national, and so this timeline just helps a bit situate where we're at in the presentation. So first, if we're looking at a brief history of international commitments regarding invasive alien species. So Canada was the first industrialized country to ratify the UN Convention on Biological Diversity in December 1992, and we became a party to it in December 93. And Environment and Climate Change Canada acts as the focal point for the Convention on Biological Diversity. And so that means that any requests from the CBD, as we call it, would come through ECCC. And within the Environment and Climate Change Canada is the Canadian Wildlife Service that is responsible for reporting and reaching out to other partners and stakeholders to report on implementation and also to encourage the implementation of commitments agreed upon under the CBD. So following the ratification of the CBD, the Government of Canada worked with provinces and territories to develop the Canadian Biodiversity Strategy in 1995. And by 1996, all Canadian jurisdictions signed a statement of commitment to use that strategy as a guide to implementing the convention in Canada. And so the Canadian Biodiversity Strategy has helped identify and recognize a shared responsibility of all levels of governments when it comes to biodiversity issues as a whole, as well as the role of Indigenous peoples play in conservation. And so you'll note at the bottom of the slide that at the federal level at that time in the strategy, we talked about harmful alien organisms and not invasive alien species. But since then, we've changed to use the term invasive alien species. And the reason that we use it, it mirrors a bit more closely what's done at the Convention on Biological Diversity. And you'll see that there's an annex, there's a slide looking at the various definition, but just to note that this is something like oftentimes when we talk with partners, our partners talk about invasive species. At the federal level, we talk about invasive alien species, and it also looks at invasive alien species coming to Canada and not necessarily those that may be moving from one province to another. So that's just something to note in terms of how we report on things as well. And so in 2004, there was the release of an invasive alien species strategy for Canada. So it was also developed and approved by federal, provincial, and territorial ministers responsible for wildlife, forests, and fisheries, and aquaculture as well. And the strategy really seeks to minimize the risk of invasive species to the environment, to the economy and society through this sort of hierarchical approach. So it prioritizes prevention, then early detection, rapid response, and then control and management in that order. And the strategy also seeks to enhance leadership and coordination, risk analysis, science and technology, performance promotion, engagement of Canadians in this fight against invasive alien species, and international cooperation as well. So it really tries to look at the whole range of things that can be done to try to address the issue of invasive alien species. But again, I think it's important to remember this hierarchy, and so looking at the prevention side of things, and also thus focus on priority pathways of introduction for invasive alien species. So the strategy really reinforced the need for the collaborative implementation of measures when dealing with invasive alien species. The strategy itself identified 3 federal ministerial leads. So the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, and the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And so within the strategy, what we see is that ECCC's role is very much one of policy coordination at the federal level and at the national level as well. Some federal departments and agencies have a different role to play. So for example, more in terms of prevention. So we can think of the Canadian Border Service Agency, Transport Canada, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency have a role that's very geared toward prevention. Some work more in science. So we can think of Natural Resource Canada, the Canadian Forest Service within Natural Resource Canada, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and then some other work also more in management. So Fisheries and Ocean Canada does a lot of that. Again, the Food Inspection Agency, and then also the Parks Canada Agency. And so management at the federal level is really done on federally regulated species. And then provinces and territories have a role to play within their own mandates. So there's the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and the Canadian Food Inspection Agencies have a list of regulated aquatic invasive species or invasive insects, for example. Or plants that they're really focusing on. But ECCC doesn't have that, for example, for terrestrial species. And so that's kind of interesting as one of the leads at the federal level and the focal point on the Convention on Biological Diversity, that we don't have a stronger role in this. But I'll say that the department works in terms of manages invasive alien species under true circumstances. So if they are found in national wildlife areas, which are managed by our department, and also if they are identified as a threat to a specific species at risk, then there is a mandate to address that threat. There's also an annex to this presentation that looks a bit more closely at the role of each department as well. So if we continue looking at how IS and the role of the department work in chronological order, so we'll note that there was a strategic plan for biodiversity 2011-2012, including the Aichi biodiversity targets that were agreed upon by parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity in 2010. And then following this, the Government of Canada with provinces and territories adopted a domestic response to those global targets, which also included a target on invasive alien species. Those were only adopted in 2015, so it took quite a bit of negotiations to get to that point, and we've been trying to report on those since then. And under that process, we also looked at indicators and tracking progress on what has been done in terms of invasive alien species. Also in parallel, and looking more specifically at invasive alien species, there was an ad hoc federal, provincial, territorial task force that was set in place to see if, for example, the strategy needed to be revamped or how to implement it better. And the task force found that the strategy from 2004 was still valid and relevant, but they made 3 main recommendations. And one of the recommendations was to have a permanent national, so federal, provincial, territorial committee to look at policy coordination. And that committee is the Invasive Alien Species National Committee, for which I'm the secretariat. And so the ISNC, as we call it, is co-chaired by Environment and Climate Change Canada and the Ontario government. On it, all PTs are represented on it except for Prince Edward Island and Nunavut. And we also have some federal partners, other departments that sit on the committee because of their involvement in dealing with invasive alien species. So the ISNC is really a horizontal committee. So we're looking to support the implementation of the strategy, and also help report back or get feedback on what, for example, our next targets under the Convention on Biological Diversity should be as it relates to invasive alien species. So we'll work to address gaps, for example, in policies and coordination with regards to all invasive alien species. So not only terrestrial, but also looking at all of them at once. So it's not an operational committee, but it's really trying to seek where we could add value to the work that is being done. And the committee also shares a lot of information from other committees that are doing more work, for example, on aquatic invasive species more specifically, or that have a more operational mandate as well. And so the ISNC have a mandate, and the mandate is actually mirrors the recommendations that were made in the recommendations report by the ad hoc task force. So the recommendation 1 led to the creation of the ISNC, and then we also continue to work with non-governmental organizations and other partners that are not part of government but have a big role to play in invasive alien species management. The second point on our mandate, which links to the recommendation 2 from the task force, focused on helping ensure that all players have a similar understanding and approach to early detection and rapid response. And then the third point in our mandate looks at recommendation 3, which really strives to recognize the roles that Canadians play in addressing this threat to biodiversity. And
Rachel, you just have a few minutes left before the 15-minute mark.
Okay, thank you. I have a timer on too, so thank you very much. Again, the ISNC tries to leverage existing jurisdictional and sectoral activities and still focuses on the prevention, the coordination, information sharing, and pathway prioritization and management. So that remains no matter the kind of work that we do. Some of the work that we work on at the moment. So one is a survey of IS related expenses. So we actually, Emily here is going to be presenting on this, I think on Thursday morning. So a study on IS related expenses that municipalities have. And so this is something that's really important. This is something too that we're going to try to see if we can expand it at the federal and provincial territorial level. So if we're looking at how to do, for example, a national inventory of invasive alien species, what are common definitions of variables that are needed to do this? Continue engagement with other committees and NGOs, as well as Indigenous leaders as well. And then also, as I mentioned before, work on the Convention on Biological Diversity, try to get information from PTs regarding, what indicators could be used and or what the next target could be, or how to implement a future target. If we look at the international level, so those are the last 2 slides. So I think something else that's going to come up that's very important, it's the Convention on Biological Diversity. We're going to agree to a post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So originally it was a post-2020 because it was supposed to be adopted in 2020, but because of COVID, it was pushed back, and it's possible that the next conference of parties would only take place in the summer or fall of 2022. And so it's looking at a new target for invasive alien species, one that could be more ambitious. And so you can see it on the screen. But again, it's looking at pathways of introductions. And this target, I think it's important to mention, is something that's still under negotiation at the international level. And it's probably not going to be the last iteration of the target that we see. And same thing for the indicator. I think the indicator is interesting, although it would be very hard for countries to actually provide any measure against it. Other important work, and that links back to the presentation that Steve did right at the beginning, is looking at what's being done in terms of science-based knowledge. So the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, had a global assessment in 2019. And it identified invasive alien species as one of the 5 direct drivers of global biodiversity loss. So this is an issue that's very important, but maybe not as mainstream as it should be. And also, IBIS also launched in 2019 a thematic assessment of invasive alien species and their control. Actually, the second order draft is currently open for comments for experts until February 15th on the IBIS website. And then the final report, including a summary for policymakers, is expected to be adopted at IBIS 10, so their 10th meeting in 2023. So that assessment will probably be very interesting for people working on invasive alien species. So I just want to thank you again for the time, for being here, for inviting me on this panel. It's been really interesting. If you have any questions, there's my email address as well as the address of the secretariat should you have any other questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. So I'm going to wrap up there. Thank you everyone for your participation on the first day of the 2022 Invasive Species Forum hosted by the ISC in partnership with Ontario's Ministry of Northern Development, Mines, Natural Resources and Forestry. I want to give a special thanks again to all the speakers and panelists for sharing their knowledge and projects related to invasive species prevention and management. And I'm now going to sign off and close today's sessions. We do invite you to come back onto Zoom just in about 5 minutes at 3:45 and join us for the inaugural ISC Awards ceremony, where Sarah Rang will kick off the awards program as we recognize and celebrate the leadership and commitment of individuals or organizations who help keep Canada's land and water free from invasive species. Great. Thanks so much, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, Emily.
Yeah, thank you so much.